Cloud Native. I've got Viktor from Upbound here to talk about Crossplane, and I'm so excited. How are you doing today, Viktor?
Excellent. Always good. It's like,
Awesome.
immutable. You reach certain state and then you don't change it.
How long have you been in that state? For like years now, or a couple weeks?
Years.
Years.
Yeah.
Well, say it was. All right, let me make sure everything's going live everywhere. All right, so I'll go get started. It was great to see you at KubeCon. I hadn't met you in person yet, so it was great to finally walk up to you and actually see you and talk to you for a few minutes. Thanks so much for taking time to talk to me there. I'm sure you had tons of people come up take pictures and everything.
I mean, that's the purpose of KubeCon is not to go
Yeah,
to talks, is to meet all the people.
that was the most fun part for me is people come up to the booth just talking or asking about what the company does. They never heard about it or anything like that, and then being able to talk about open source projects was the most fun too. I got to make a video where I went and talked to a couple of the projects, so that was the most fun that I think I had. All right, so how was KubeCon for you? What was the most memorable thing? Just meeting people, or you obviously said not going to
Meeting.
talks?
So I feel ashamed, but I will admit it. I mean, I don't feel ashamed. I will admit it. I haven't attended a single talk besides keynotes. Uh, I personally find more value. That's opportunity for me. First of all, to catch up with colleagues, right? Kind of, I don't see colleagues except over Zoom, and then all the other people. It's opportunity to meet and greet.
I agree. I didn't get to go to anything but the keynotes either, just because I was manning the booth and talking to people. But I got to meet people in from Upbound and Crossplane that I hadn't met before, and I had talked to previously online. I got to meet people from Knative and all these other groups. Rook, so it was so exciting to see people in person for the first time, and it feels like forever, right? Last time I saw that many people in person was an OpenStack summit way back in 2014 or 15, right? So it felt big. It was a very big event. There was a ton of vendors. There was tons of people. It was a lot of fun. I haven't done a wrap up on KubeCon. I might have to do that in the next week or two. But
So
let's go ahead.
does it mean that you're coming to Amsterdam then?
If I'm coming, what?
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam? No. So I don't know if I'll go to Amsterdam, but I probably will be in Chicago. I don't have a passport. I need to get my passport updated. I've let that lapse because I haven't left.
Shame on you, Don. That shame, man.
I haven't.
Kind of like.
Well, I haven't left the U.S. in 7 years, I think now, which is crazy, right? I used to do OpenStack stuff, so I went to Paris, and then since then I haven't been able to leave. Now I want to go to Vancouver, but I think our license will let me just go into Canada. So I don't know. Amsterdam would be a lot of fun. I haven't been there except to fly through it once, so I'd love to. Will you be there?
Yeah, I'm part of the furniture
Yeah,
in KubeCon. I'm always there.
you're always there until it's done, in 2040 or something like that, and the next thing comes in. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and get into some questions and stuff. And if anyone has any questions or wants to add anything or ask anything too, please feel free. So let's start out. So what is Crossplane? That's what we're here to talk about.
So I can probably come up with 5 different definitions. If you want a kind of 2 words, it's a or 4 words for control plane for everything, right? So let me give you first. Let me start with my definition of Kubernetes, right? I don't think that Kubernetes is something that designed to run exclusively your containers, right? It's just that containers were the first logical implementation or thingy that we do in Kubernetes, right? You mentioned that you had a stream with KubeVirt, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So kind of, hey, I can use Kubernetes to manage my virtual machines. All of a sudden, it's not only about containers. Or if you do use containers, you probably use Ingress. All of a sudden, you manage Elastic Load Balancer, right?
Or you start looking like Rook and you're managing Ceph or something like that, right? You're doing all these interesting external things.
Exactly. Yeah. So even without people really connecting the dots, Kubernetes from the very start was not only about containers, one way or another, right? And the design, when you look at it, it's clearly that the main advantage, clearly, from my perspective, is really Kubernetes is all about the API, extensible API through custom resource definitions, through which we get different operators that do different things inside or outside of the cluster, right? Now, with that in mind, Crossplane is a way how to extend Kubernetes as a control plane to manage everything. Now, everything, there is a asterisk over there saying as long as there is available provider, which you can create yourself. So really, it's about extending Kubernetes, converting it into control plane for whatever you need, right? So kind of that's what your one-stop shop becomes. Hey, what do you need? You need to run containers? Excellent, run containers. You need virtual machines inside of your cluster, KubeVirt, excellent, right? You need to create EC2 instances in AWS. Again, Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Kubernetes. And Crossplane gives you precisely that, a way how to get one-to-one mapping, custom resource definitions in Kubernetes that match something somewhere, like EC2 instance, like GitHub repository, whatever. And then you manage that something by creating custom resources based on those custom resource definitions. Just as you are creating custom resources to tell Kubernetes that there is Argo CD application, right? That does something. So really the goal of Kubernetes is to become a control plane for whatever you need. And that's, that's one of the two main areas, right? The second is something we call compositions, right? And compositions allow you to create a service that somebody else will consume. So you create and say, hey, people in my company, I do not want to receive Jira tickets anymore whenever somebody says I need a cluster. And they, requesters of a cluster or anything else, Lambda, application definition, people are also getting sick of me because they need to wait until I do something. So instead of that Jira flow, and I'm using Jira as example, right? Nothing against Jira in this context. You can create something called composition, which says, hey, I'm going to create a new custom resource definition that will be called X, whatever that is. And then I will define what will that become. Like I'm going to create a custom resource definition called our clusters. Clusters is going to be a long name. Clusters underscore specially made for our organization that are doing whatever we want them to do. And whenever somebody needs a cluster, they will create a manifest that is tailor-made to what matters to them. Like, I don't know, number of nodes. I don't care about VPCs. Nobody cares about VPCs, right? I'm going to hide that. So I'm going to expose things that matter, hide things that don't. And I'm going to, when somebody creates those resources based on those compositions, in the background, Kubernetes will do the dance. So clusters should have EKS and node group and subnets and VPCs, internet gateway, all the madness.
All the decisions you don't want the developers to make on their own. They're like trying to figure it out on their own.
So it's about, think of it as a tool to create your own internal developer platform. So, or one popular phrase would be to create your own Heroku. And now, if you don't know what Heroku is, then you're just recently graduated, right? But Heroku was an epiphany of well-designed platforms, I say.
So I say, like, after you get over the hurdle of learning a little bit about how to use Kubernetes and containers, if you're coming from virtual machines, I think one of my friends said it, like, after I'd been using it for like a year or two, I didn't really understand it until getting into open source stuff. It's like a developer platform, right? Like that's the interesting thing is like Knative, Crossplane, all these other things come up because of the platform that it's built to actually have a controller and a reconciliation loop. So it can go through and actually translate stuff that you're trying to create into something else, into a Kubernetes resource, into an AWS resource or anything like that, which is pretty awesome. That's why I think it'll stick around longer than like some of these older projects that are kind of all split up and everything. It empowers you to develop things and use your developers to make things internal that you need. Right. So where did Crossplane the idea come from? Like that. So was it, do you have that backstory, the history of it, or?
No, not really. I joined or I became obsessed with Crossplane after it was born. So I don't know where the idea comes from. But I would say it was almost inevitable in terms that, and Crossplane is not alone, right? Kind of like we see many other projects that are realizing two things I would say. First, how beneficial it is to leverage some of the features or capabilities of Kubernetes itself, right? Hey, I mean, doing drift detection reconciliation, that's not easy. Kind of like, why would you develop that, right? And we can have that now, and we do have it with Kubernetes. And there are other projects like Copy or AWS has CK, or whatever the name is. Google has its own thing, right? Kind of, I think that we are all converging towards Kubernetes being the base on top of which other
Yeah.
stuff is built. And then we have amazing benefits. And those, if we go back in time, I mean, even today, up to extent, if you have some amazing project, right? That project had to build the ecosystem around itself, right? Without naming. Let's say Jenkins. I'm going to use Jenkins as an example, right?
Okay.
Jenkins had to build, and it did a wonderful job kind of building that ecosystem through plugins and stuff like that, right? But that's a tedious work. What we're doing now, I think, and I'm not talking about Crossplane, but in general, creating projects that follow certain rules, call it being Kubernetes native, and then saying, I do not need really to take care about everything that is required because I'm part of the ecosystem, right? Oh, you need logging. Why would I develop logging for Crossplane? There is Locky, right? Or whichever solution you're using. You need monitoring. There is monitoring. You need GitOps. There is GitOps, right? It's all about when we all build on top of Kubernetes, I think that we are all getting the benefits of that huge ecosystem, right? And that's what distinguishes, I would say, today Kubernetes native projects, I think, from almost anything else. Simply the power of collaboration on the same platform, right?
Yeah. You need certs. You need all this different things, right? Like, yeah. All right. So so you mentioned like cluster deployment. How does Crossplane do that, and how does it differ from CAPI, right? Like, are you describing things differently so you can actually describe like a cluster and deploy it with Crossplane too? I was thinking it was just like other resources, not full clusters.
So CAPI is focused on clusters, right? And it does a very good job at that. And it is a way how to create cluster here or there, wherever that something is. And that's basically the end of the story. Crossplane is not focused on that level goal, but more on a goal that provides you the resources that are required for a cluster, like VPC, Internet Gateway, whatever that is, right? And resources that are not part of the cluster, because we can also use it to manage databases or whatever, lambdas, whatever you need, right? So that's kind of on an abstraction level, that's the difference, right? Crossplane gives you resources, individual resources, like while CAPI is about a cluster itself. And on top of that, there is that composition thing that allows you to define what cluster means for you, right? Not what CAPI allows you to do or doesn't allow, but kind of to fine tune and say, this is the cluster for me, right? This is how we do clustering in our organization. In our organization, cluster is not only AWS resources like VPCs, whatever, but it's also, hey, and this stuff should be installed in that cluster, and kind of, so it's much wider scope, right? The goal
Gotcha.
of Kubernetes, of Crossplane, is really to eventually, and this is where community jumps in, right? To create resources that match everything.
Yeah.
You want to order Domino pizzas from Kubernetes? Well, just create a provider.
Well, I guess that's where the next question comes in, and you probably get this all the time. Why would I use Crossplane over Terraform? And what are the big benefits of Crossplane over Terraform?
So I see Terraform as, and I'm going to put it in the same bucket. Like, so let's say that we have. I think that we have three phases of those types of tools, right? The first phase was with CF Engine, later on Chef, Puppet, and Ansible to an extent, that said, okay, we're going to manage stuff in a mutable way, right? Mutable, that's important. And then Terraform came along and says, okay, no, actually, today, most of the things are immutable. It works differently, right? And Pulumi and other tools. But the problem with those tools, not the problem is if it's badly designed, but simply the world changed slightly, is that they're client-side tools. I'm going to execute something at some moment in time, and then something will happen, right? So if I would make a parallel with applications, that would be closer to how when we were managing applications with SSH, right? Kind of like, I'm going to go to this server, and I'm going to do this. And if anything happens between now and the next time I do the same thing, then, well, tough luck, right? Kubernetes is different. Kubernetes, we are not really instructing it that I want this right now. We're instructing Kubernetes by saying, this is the state of something I want. And this equally applies to Crossplane like anything else in Kubernetes. This is the state I want. And I'm making a contract with you that from now on, it's your job to manage the state, no matter what happens. If a node goes down, create it. If this changes, undo it. If somebody goes to a web console of AWS, and I'm using as AWS, and deletes something or changes something, undo it because you made a contract. This is what you want. And that equally applies to deployment that creates a replica set, that creates pods. So think of it actually, if I'm inventing an analogy right now, right? With Terraform, you do something like create a pod, and it runs as long as it runs. With Crossplane, it's closer to creating a deployment in Kubernetes, right? You're instructing it, this is what I want, and you should create behind the scenes replica set that manages pods and guarantees certain things and so on and so forth. So that drift detection and reconciliation is a huge difference. Second difference, I think, is the existence of API. Now, if we forget about infrastructure as code and all that stuff, right? Yeah. Nobody would build anything without API today, right? You need the API so that you can communicate with it, that you can query. Like, I want to know, so I have a cluster, okay, but I want to know how many instances, EC2 instances I have, right? And not for this project, but across the whole organization or across the team, right? Being able to use the API to instruct it about the state, to query it, and so on and so forth is just something that I don't think that anybody would not have today, if starting from scratch, right?
So like when you've created resources, you can go to the kubectl and you can pull information about like what you've created and get information that way quickly instead of going to like the engineering team. Like so people that have access, you can just can view what's going on.
Yeah, I mean with Terraform, you can say somebody would probably now in comments say, oh, but you can do Terraform plan. Yes, within a project, not across the organization. You cannot filter it. You cannot do this, that there is simply certain benefit of having an API in general. Nothing to do directly related with Crossplane, right? So having the API, and then there is that ecosystem. Let's say you want to use GitOps. What are the major tools today? I don't know, Argo CD, Flux, Rancher Fleet, whatever. What do they assume? That your resources, that you are defining something as a Kubernetes resource. If that assumption is not fulfilled, you cannot do it. Right? The same thing, that's going back to the story of the ecosystem. Yeah, you want to monitor. How do you monitor the state of your infrastructure? Well, Prometheus. That's how we monitor in Kubernetes. And if our infrastructure is managed from Kubernetes, then all of a sudden, we have it.
So are you of the mindset that eventually everyone will move to Kubernetes from VMs and stuff like that? There's still obviously some use cases where that's difficult, and I guess you could use KubeVirt.
No.
But
so I think that's the. I'm not actually making that assumption at all. I think that we will continue having things like Lambda. I think that we will continue having things like Google Cloud Run, based on Knative, but not running on Kubernetes, right? And managed databases, right? Somebody wants to manage self-managed database. That's great. Somebody wants to use RDS. I'm not really, all the time, I'm not talking about the Kubernetes that runs containers. Yeah. I'm talking about Kubernetes being a control plane. You need a place from where you manage your stuff. And if we would all have nothing and start from scratch today, I cannot imagine a better base for such a control plane than Kubernetes.
That's an interesting idea. It's like, instead of just running containers for my developers, something like that, we're going to use VMs or stuff, but I want to have a platform for them. And I want to give them a way to create things in self-service, but I'm not using that as my main infrastructure because I've got this legacy stuff, but I could still use Kubernetes for something. That's interesting take. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So I know examples of without revealing too much, of people using Crossplane to manage their VMs managed by VMware, right? If there is, I'm talking about Kubernetes being a control plane, place from where you manage stuff. And now, if you run containers, great for you, kind of like we all do, right? But so I don't really care much from that context whether it's a container or it's Lambda or a third something, managed
Yeah.
database.
All right, so gotcha. All right, so let's move on to the next thing then. So you already kind of touched on, the difference between like run once and reconciliation between Terraform and Crossplane. So I guess there's a project I saw, Upjet. I know we're talking about Crossplane, but Upjet too. So that kind of bridges the gap, does it? Like between Terraform and moving over to like Crossplane? Like what does that do?
No, not this. The goal is actually different. So the story is that when doesn't matter whichever tool you choose and start from scratch, and you want to have providers that manage something by interacting with the API of that provider, you're going to face very soon two challenges. First, the volume. Like AWS, I think, has close to 1,000 different resources or services, right? So you need to codify an interaction with those 1,000, give or take. And then you will realize a second thing, that some of those services are not a single API, but multiple APIs. So it's not 1,000, it's more than 1,000. And then you're going to realize a third thing, that they're not uniform. It's not that my first reaction in the past was, okay, so once I figure out, I don't know, API of EC2, VPC will be easier, right? No.
Was it like
Absolutely
different
not.
teams are all developing the API, so it's a little bit different?
Exactly, and different rules and different. So the work of codifying interaction, and I'm now limiting myself to AWS, is tremendous, and it's ongoing, right? And then you add on top of that Azure and Google and DigitalOcean and GitHub, and the list goes on and on, infinite.
And tracking
And
updates
that's
every single
ongoing.
time they do an update, and making sure that you've developed that into it.
Yeah. Now, we are living in open source world, right? And we're all kind of advancing on shoulders of others, which is normal, which is kind of what makes open source awesome. So we created Upjet project, or Jet, that evaluates. It's a code generation more than anything, right? It evaluates Terraform module and generates the code, Go code in our case, that becomes Crossplane provider, right? And that speeds up that writing from scratch interaction with the API. So it's a code generation tool that gives us high coverage very, very fast, right? Infinitely faster than doing it from scratch. So that's a code generation tool that gives us coverage of major providers, not only major providers, but quite a few others, that from people not coming from Upbound are contributing, like Scaleway, for example. Hey, how can we generate Crossplane provider for our services? Well, you can spend amount of time going through our SDK and writing Go code, or you can, if there is already a Terraform module, you can use Jet provider or Jet code generation to generate the provider. I will not say in a minute, but very, very fast.
So you're taking advantage of some of the stuff that's already been developed for like Terraform, and you're just kind of implementing it. So you're speeding up how fast you can do stuff. That's awesome too. Yeah, I didn't know that's what it was. I was thinking it was just stuff I've written internally in house. I can just convert it. Not that there's all these other community resources I can just use. And I guess I should have thought of that.
Yeah. So today, for example, so let's say that you have something. Let's say that you want to get DigitalOcean, and let's imagine, even though that's not true, that the provider doesn't exist. Well, you can create a provider from scratch. It will take you a couple of days, or you can use, or depends on the number of APIs you need to implement, or you can use Jet provider to generate it yourself.
Awesome.
Faster.
So let's move on to the next question then. So I'm a developer. What does Crossplane look like to me, right? Like what is my day-to-day interaction with it? Like, am I just still submitting stuff to like GitHub and describing things that I want, and I'm using like Helm, or what does it look like?
So in most cases, there is that. Most cases, the end users, let's call it application developers, are not using Crossplane directly, but using those compositions. I mean, meaning that using those custom resource definitions, creating custom resources based on custom resource definitions that some other, let's say, experts in Kubernetes or cloud or whatever created for them, right? Hiding that complexity. So usually we're talking about, I don't know, 10, 20, maybe 30 lines of YAML, a lot to get something. So it's a way to abstract, to define, or to provide resources as services to others. So ops create compositions and say, this is how you do this. Application developers, and whatever that is, doesn't matter, whatever it is, create that simple YAML that consumes that as a service, right? Oh, I want a backend application. And behind the backend application will be, I don't know, like I'm inventing now. This is the image, this is the host, or whatever we agreed, ops and devs. And behind the scenes, it will create virtual service and ingress and whatever you need, right?
So then you can rely on like RBAC or something, right? Instead of actually doing like a Jira ticket and then self-service waiting, right? Like if you've got the permissions, you can create it.
Now, once you create that manifest, simple one, you have two options. You can do directly kubectl apply or Helm or whatever you're using. Or what I see a lot is kind of like, hey, you don't need access to the cluster, and in this case, management cluster. We have Argo CD or Flux or whatever, whichever GitOps tools we have. All they have to do is push it to Git, right? It's already configured to monitor that repository. So I think that we are moving responsibility of end users from interacting directly with the live system towards interacting with Git repositories. That's actually really the interface.
So like if you're a developer and you've got a new project, you might just submit a ticket to, hey, add this repository to Argo to monitor, and then it'll deploy for me, right? Like instead of, okay, cool. Well, that's awesome. So what does it look like for a platform engineer then? So what's the difference for me now? Now you said I'm making contracts with developers, kind of like what's been going on for the last, I don't know, 20, 30, like forever, right? Like, but now I'm saying, okay, these are the things that you can have, and then I'm exposing these to you, and you can deploy them, or you're just saying like Argo, right? Like maybe I'm creating a, I don't know, a values thing that they just need to put values in, and then I'm taking that and I'm applying it to a chart or something that you're saying.
Yeah, except that you can have a chart. You don't have to really, because to me the great value of Helm is being able to convert complex stuff into templates and expose that complex stuff as values. And all that complexity is on a client, meaning on your laptop, right? Here I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about moving the complexity into a cluster. So all the stuff is happening in a cluster. You imagine having a Helm that only contains exclusively and nothing else a values file.
So it's kind of like Knative, right? Like where really you're abstracting it all.
It's a real definition. So spec kind, so it's not values, it's a real definition, but saying you interact only with the equivalent of values file. And you can use Helm, that's great, but there is no strong need, because really we're dealing with a small amount of YAML, right?
And you can decide, so you can decide what values are important from the developer, and then just say, put in these values and you're done. So it could be like 3 things, right? Like
gotcha. You're literally creating a new object type in Kubernetes that is whatever you agreed it to be.
That's kind of like what some of the other projects are, right? Like people they might write all this stuff to deploy like a load balancer and then like a deployment and all that stuff. But then all these other projects like Knative just abstract that and give you like a single YAML that you just put a couple things in. Same idea.
Knative is actually a great example, right? Knative, from my perspective, simplifies greatly what I need to define, right? Typically, Knative YAML, what is it? 20 lines, 30?
It's very short.
Crazy, right? Behind the scenes, it will create a bunch of things. It will deploy horizontal pod autoscaler and ingress and a lot of things. So it's the same thing. The only difference between, the most important difference between Knative and Crossplane is that Knative is what it is, and Crossplane allows you to create Knative-like experience yourself.
Well, that's awesome. So you could create like you said the clusters, going back to there. Like I could have like a cluster object that I've created, and I just take a couple of things, and that'll translate to all these other objects you're talking about, like storage and I gotcha. That makes sense.
Let's say a database, right? Kind of if you ask a application developer, okay, what do you need? What do you want to manage? Do you want to manage the database yourself? And after initial fear and all that stuff, when things calm down and that person says yes, you ask, okay, what do you care about? And I bet that person cares whether it's Postgres or MySQL, cares about whether it's version 11 or 12, and like 5 more things. And then you say, okay, so I'm going to give you actually definition that contains those 5 things. And
so is that like the interaction usually you see?
The things you never heard about
Yeah.
are going to be behind the scenes, just as Helm does, but it's happening in a cluster now, not all bundled on client side.
Have you worked with any like people implementing and stuff too, and like looked at like what the discussions are between the platform and the development team? It's kind of just goes kind of like that. Like they just ask like, what do you want? What things do you care about? Like I can do that for you. So like, is that like a normal interaction?
I mean, I've seen different approaches. Like some more traditional is, platform team, and what I'm going to say fails almost always. Platform team is locked in a room, figures out what they think that everybody needs, then spends infinite amount of time building it, and then they go and say, do you like it? And people say no, because that's not what I need. And then they go to CTO and say, can you make a executive order that everybody has to use this, right? That's how many companies were building platforms long time ago, right? And still, the real, I think, way to do it is first not to make anything mandatory. I think that the application developer, if you don't like to use my service, you shouldn't be forced to. And if you end up not using it, then that's a clear sign that I did something bad. Just like business, right? You open an online store and people choose to go to Amazon instead of your store. Well, you did something bad, wrong. Ignoring now that nobody can compete with Amazon and stuff like that, right? So treat your application developers as customers. And once that sinks in, you need to fulfill the needs of your customers. It says yes, it's business.
So now I'm running a repository where I get people to submit feature requests and describe to me what they want, and then I'm implementing that and giving them a resource, which
exactly.
It's a little bit more interactive, a little bit more fun. Plus, like the platform team's already getting pretty good with GitHub. So I think that's one of the biggest changes in the last like 15 years. Is like before, like in 2005 or 2010 or so, I wasn't using GitHub as an administrator, system administrator, or like platform team or whatever. And now it's like I have to know how it works. I have to know how to use it. I've written a little bit ago, so I enjoy using GitHub. I love it. I love it for open source projects and stuff too. Let me find the next question. All right, so
sure.
I think we kind of touched on most of this because you've answered almost all of it pretty much. I think you've already kind of answered like, what are the benefits of defining resources in Kubernetes and providing an API to like CRUD them. Like that's super beneficial because then anybody can interact with it, and you can do RBAC and other policies to make sure they either don't have access or use Argo. So I guess, let's talk about Actin. You kind of brought that up, AWS controllers for Kubernetes. So would I use Crossplane, and is there a provider for that? Like, so like all these other big, like Amazon, Azure and stuff, they're kind of creating this, right? Like I can use Crossplane if I want to have like a single platform still to interact with all of them. Like, is that the benefit of using Crossplane instead of just going full in with Act?
I mean, we start with the premise that everybody is multi-cloud. And now this will freak out people, because the first association when I say that is people say, no, I have everything in AWS, or I have everything in Azure. But that's a very narrow definition of what cloud is. Is GitHub cloud?
Was like your on-prem
is
part?
Datadog cloud? Is Grafana cloud, right? Kind of cloud is services offered and managed by somebody for you, right? And from that perspective, everybody is multi-cloud. Everybody, it's enough to be in AWS and GitHub. You're multi-cloud, man. And the more you have, the harder it is to manage, right? And that's the problem we're essentially trying to solve. And now, on the other end, I see already showing, and it will increase, that there are more and more variations of provider with the same destination, meaning that right now we have two providers for AWS. I'm using it as an example. Call it Crossplane native or Crossplane coded from scratch. And then there is Upjet that I mentioned, which for us, it's the official one. And tomorrow we will use whatever is I always forget how the AWS call their operators to manage resources.
AWS controllers for Kubernetes. That, or you're talking about AC? Yeah.
Right. So yeah. So kind of those are just the interfaces Crossplane interacts with, right? And there is no, the only limit is how much community integrates with.
So it's like even if I'm using Amazon right now, like you said, it's an interesting take on it, saying like, yeah, I do rely on GitHub. I rely on these other providers and stuff. So like it is more than just my infrastructure. But like if say I'm just starting out with Amazon, I need to think forward and say, hey, maybe I don't want everything in Amazon. Maybe I want Azure, I want Bare OS or Bare Metal or something like that too. So I need to think of this as a platform that can interact with all of these instead of building everything on one. Or like, so
exactly.
Say Crossplane's a good way to not be locked in to specific
even if
thing.
you say, I'm fine, everything is AWS, even the code repository, I always forget the name, whatever. There is a code repository. I'm not even using GitHub. Everything, literally, 100% in Amazon. There is still the other part of the story about compositions. You still need to figure out how do you combine those services into something meaningful, because VPC is not meaningful to anybody for anything, or EKS alone doesn't work. You need a node group, you need subnets, you need to somehow, there are two layers, right? Resources, individual resources like EC2, and then how do you combine those? That's compositions. Others might have the first layer or part of the first layer of interaction with individual resources, but compositions is very, very unique to Crossplane.
So I think one of the benefits of that too is that you can track who's doing things, whereas like some cloud providers may not give you that information anymore because of data privacy laws. Now you've got your own Argo or something like that running, and you're saying, okay, this came from this GitHub repository. I can clean everything up. I don't have to go like search for where everything is.
There comes another. I'm kind of backtracking now, going back to the question about Terraform, and I'm going to use Terraform just as an example, not applies to everybody else, is if you give me to self-manage myself stuff, let's say create a database, right? The only option you have is to give me permissions to create all the resources, and this is in a best case scenario related to the database, right? If right now I say, create a database in my account, and I give you Terraform files on your laptop, you need to have permissions to do all those things, right? Now with compositions, I'm not giving permissions for anybody to create any resource. I'm giving you permission to create something called Viktor's cluster, right? Because behind the scenes is, again, it's happening inside of the management cluster. I control which abstraction you can manage and create, right? And in which namespace and with what rules and stuff like that. You will never see a VPC. I mean, unless I allow you to do it, right? Especially if you combine it with OPA or Gatekeeper or Kyverno, then I already forgot the question. I'm not sure even whether I'm answering.
They probably want the VPC. It's
you might need to push me back on track, man.
Being able to track and figure out who created what if you need to do cleanup. Like that's the one of the big benefits, right? Like it's, I think like when I was at IBM before, like we had developers that were creating clusters and it was 100 my dash clusters. And I had no idea who created it. So I couldn't be like, oh, this is important. They're actually doing real work on it. I just have to be like, oh, I'm going to delete it because it's my cluster and I have no idea who owns this. So like to make sure that I'm not spending way too much and like lose track of stuff, I got to delete it. So I think
that's where Git comes into play. GitOps, man.
Yes. Yeah. Well, they could be like, okay, this is
nobody can do anything but push to Git.
All right, let me move on to the next thing. I think we kind of talked about Crossplane for a good amount of time. Let's go ahead and go back to KubeCon for a minute. Anything interesting that was presented at KubeCon about Crossplane? I saw it on, I think the keynote. So many different places. Everyone's talking about it. So, what's the most interesting thing you think came out at KubeCon about Crossplane? You want to talk about?
I haven't seen a single talk. I have no idea. I mean, I've seen. You know, I was either chatting with people, and then kind of there are interesting projects that we were discussing and interesting things happening at booths and things like that. But from the talk perspective, wrong person. I can
Gotcha.
only the only talk I attended only one. Depends whether you count KubeCon or only day zero. If you when you say
Yeah,
KubeCon,
not
if you
all of
mean
it.
only those two,
Yeah.
well, all of it, then there are only 5 talks I attended because I was forced to. I spoke on them.
Okay. So your talks are that have the best information. And
I don't know about the rest, but a lot of I haven't seen, at least if I go from the exhibitor kind of like perspective, going around the hall and stuff like that, not much new I've seen since Valencia, which is only half a year ago.
maybe just a little bit more awareness
So
and everything. Like it seemed like the booth was
I
pretty
have, I
busy
have
over.
I have impression that we are slowly getting into consolidation phase. Before, like 5 years ago, whatever you saw in KubeCon, 80% you will not see next time. It will be something completely different. Kind of like,
Yes.
companies just appear and disappear overnight. So I think that we have consolidation around projects, which is kind of, I think, I like innovation, but on the other hand, we are in a level of madness that nobody can follow anymore,
Yes.
right?
Oh, it's so hard to keep up. It's like everyone's like, "Oh, did you see this project?" I haven't even heard of that project. No, I haven't heard of it. And then you like look at it, like, oh, that sounds like something that would actually be useful. I think another interesting one that like one of my friends had talked to me about, but I didn't really understand how it worked was like backstage, and that seemed pretty cool. But how do I contribute to Crossplane? Crossplane.io, or where do I go? Where do I
You go
start?
to github.com/crossplane, pick a repository. So there is Crossplane core. That would be great to contribute, but that's usually not the main.
Gotcha.
Providers are typically people choose kind of, I want to contribute to Equinix Metal provider or DigitalOcean or AWS or, for example, Kubernetes. It doesn't even have to be related with virtual machines, kind of like anything, or create a new provider.
So you're looking for contributors. You're looking for people to like work on different projects and even help with docs. Technical writers are always helpful too.
Anything. Kind of like, I think that we are looking for the same things. Like every open source project looks kind of, and I always encourage people to, if you're new to open source, don't start something huge. Kind of, I think that people underestimate the need and how helpful it is to, create a PR because a comma is missing in a docs. Kind of anything.
That's how I
doesn't have
started.
to be exactly kind of really anything. And
You learn the
time,
process.
kind of exactly, learn the process. People are friendly. You create a pull request. There is already when you create an issue, you will get a form you fill in, so it guides you. And from there on, you fork the repo, create a pull request, and
go look at
the
issues,
rest of
see what
community
reviews
is
are tagged
eternally
to it.
grateful.
We'll say go look at issues, see what PRs are attached to it, and then go look at that and maybe even help review, right? Like, because I think the biggest issue I think I heard was like a lot of the groups are saying we're so popular, we've got so many pull requests, we can't keep up, right? Like there's just so much stuff that can get integrated and added in there, we just can't review all of it. So please come help us review. So
exactly. I mean, eventually, kind of, the best case scenario is you get involved, you keep getting involved, and once the community sees that you're involved, you become core maintainer. Then from there on, you can approve other people's pull requests and all the jazz, right?
And then you're super invested. All right, so we'll finish up here because we're getting close to time, and I know you've had a pretty busy day. So where can I see you next? What conference are you going to be presenting at next? Where are you going to be?
Oh, wait, live or let's say in person. I to be honest,
in person
I'm
or
not very
virtual?
fond of. Virtual next week in Worldwide Software Architecture Summit and DevOps Experience, two next week. Virtual, but the only one left that I'm going in person this year is OpenConf in Athens, Greece.
Okay, awesome. So anything else you want to add before we finish out?
I like helping people. So if there is any question, any help, anything I can do, just ping me on Twitter, LinkedIn, send a carrier pigeon, anything.
I can agree,
I'm
super
easy to
helpful. That's how
find.
I have this whole setup, because I asked all your opinions on how do I make my video look better, and you helped me out so much. I really appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Victor. Thanks for coming on. I'm excited about Crossplane. It was fun going to the booth and talking to Jared and everyone else. Like there's a lot of buzz at KubeCon. So let me give information about next week. Next week we'll be talking about Knative. I have a little bit of experience with Knative, so we'll have someone on about that.
If you ask me for a top 10 projects, Knative is there.
Everyone's super nice there. And all the really good people that were there went off to ChainGuard and are making all that stuff. So it's like, it was a great group. It's a great group still. I'd like to contribute again eventually. So we'll see. All right. So that's
who's coming from Knative?
Evan Anderson.
Oh, nice.
So he gave some talks and stuff, I think, at KubeCon. So he'll be a great person to have on to talk about it. So I can't wait. He helped me so much too when I was getting started in Knative and learning how to work with the open source stuff. So I'm super excited. But I say thank you again for coming on so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and end the stream. Thanks for everybody for coming and watching. And this will be on YouTube too if you want to rewatch if you missed something. So